thousands of games, hundreds of studios, dozens of Hub Market partners, an industry-leading Hub wallet, and just one API. Hub 88 is connecting businesses to a world of limitless content where the possibilities are endless. Hub 88.
And we're in. Hello and welcome one and all to yet another episode of Next in Depth, where, as you know, I'm enlisting the help of renowned industry experts to unpack the biggest questions in and around the iGaming sector. Now, in today's very special episode, we're going to be talking about marketing. We're going to be talking about creativity, or perhaps the lack thereof, especially in our wonderful iGaming sector. We're going to be talking about taking risks and why some brands seem eternally reluctant to do that. And we're going to be talking about, of course, the revolutionary changes that are already happening in creative marketing and brand building, with the number one topic in every single podcast you've ever heard in the last 12 months, AI, and what's that doing for marketing. Now, to do that, it is my great privilege to be joined by probably one of the best known marketers in the gambling industry ever. It's somebody whose work continues to echo throughout the sector and who helped to cement one of the biggest brands in the British and Irish gambling industries in the minds of, dare I say, Ken, several generations of punters. I am, of course, talking to Ken Robertson, the marketer extraordinaire and founder of the 10th Man creative advertising agency, but perhaps better known still for his role in a former life when he was the so-called Head of Mishchief at Paddy Power. Ken, thank you very much for joining me and welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Conor. Thanks for having me on. It's quite the it's my pleasure is what I'm trying to say. So doing good. And yeah, you're right. Still can't shake that Head of Mishchief title. I think it's 15 years later, and yeah, it's still the conversation breaker most of the time. So yeah, still there.
Yeah, well, I must say, Ken, when I go to my local Irish club, as I do, let's say once or twice a week, and I talk to people in there about work, and I tell them I'm in the gambling sector. They invariably, all they remember is gambling, and they tend to say to me, Conor, you work for Paddy Power, don't you? Or someone like that. And I say, no. I'm a B2B journalist and I work on the other side of things. And then invariably the conversation turns to Paddy Power's marketing and advertising stunts. And I just want to tell you, Ken, that although you're not known by name by those people, your campaigns and the voice and the tone of Paddy Power's marketing, as I said before, it does echo throughout the sector. It's probably, the strongest brand voice of just about any brand out there in the sector. So just by way of introduction, and I know we're going to talk about, of course, the 10th Man and what comes after this this change that you've been through and launching your own agency and the expansion that you're going through and getting out of gambling and into other sectors and all the interesting work that you've been working on. But back then, when you were this Head of Mishchief, you had this role. Tell us about how that kind of shaped your marketing experience, your marketing philosophy. What did you learn through that experience, and what was the kind of driving force behind what you were doing there? Because I think there's something that you used to do that's not being done by many other people.
Yeah. Look, it's a really good question, Conor. I guess, going back to when I started in Paddy Power, like it wasn't, a previous decade, it was a previous millennium. I started in 1999. I was fresh out of university. I was brought in to help launch paddypower.com, which, to be fair to the founders of Paddy Power, was the first ever online website anywhere in the world. So there was no proof points. Nobody knew if this thing was going to work, if it was going to catch on. Up until then, Paddy Power was very successful kind of Irish high street betting chain. I think around 100 shops in the Republic of Ireland only at the time. And, internet penetration was on the increase. This was a time before broadband connectivity. Everybody was still on dial-up. But, it was yeah, this whole internet thing seemed to be catching fire, and Amazon were selling plenty of books. So, the wisdom of the founders kind of came into place, and they were like, out of any industry, surely betting is made to take advantage of this new online kind of next horizon or innovation, because unlike Amazon, we've nothing to fulfill. We've no books to package up and sell. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I was brought in. The following year we launched paddypower.com, and very limited marketing budgets back in the day. So we quite deliberately decided to create this quite edgy, provocative brand as a means really to punch above our weight, as a means to extract as much possible value from something as simple as one 48 sheet poster. So what can we do to extract a huge amount of value from this poster? Well, you know what, let's try and make the poster a catalyst to generate some earned media. And that's what we did. Our launch poster for paddypower.com only ran in very few sites in the UK. And I don't know, maybe some of your listeners will remember, the creative was like two old dears, two grannies kind of crossing the road, and there was odds over each one of their head. One was 5-1, one was evens. But in the background, there was this great big 4x4 kind of bearing down on them. So the inference was, are we betting on which one crosses the zebra crossing first, or which one gets mowed down by the giant big kind of RV? So that got us on the front page of the Sun newspaper the following Saturday, which happened to be Grand National Saturday. And all of a sudden, paddypower.com was out there. So, what I learned very early doors was just, safe doesn't sell. And if you really want to stand out and be different, you need to be just that. You need to be different to the categories. So, we took a look around at what everybody else was doing, and the big kind of incumbent bookies at the time were like Ladbrokes and William Hill and Mecca and Coral. And there was just a center of gravity around this very safe approach to marketing and advertising. And again, this was 25, 26 years ago. But so the sophistication in terms of the number of betting markets was, incomparable to what it is now. So there was a couple of markets on, whatever the big televised football match would be, obviously horse racing, greyhound racing, but that was it, So, we took a look at what those guys were doing, and we said, let's do something totally different. And that really was the genesis of the Paddy Power brand that has now, become this absolute kind of Goliath in the gambling space. But sorry, to come back to your question, what was the driving force? The driving force was simple. We wanted to be the category disruptor. We wanted to be the category challenger. We didn't have the budgets of Ladbrokes and Hills and Coral and Mecca back in those days. So we needed to do something really, really different. And that difference was, the Paddy Power brand. That was the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about one of your, the launching ad for paddypower.com being fairly controversial, and of course there was no shortage of controversies that came later. So I wonder what the kind of learnings from that were in terms of how far you can actually push the boundaries of let's say taste, or pushing on people's sensibilities a little bit. Did you find there were times where you overstepped that mark slightly and feel you should have pulled back? And then conversely, do you have to kind of, even when you've learned where those limits are, do you still have to kind of push yourself, well, let's not surpass those limits just because people don't want us to, and kind of not fall into the trap of playing it safe?
Yeah. Well, look, if you want to speak to somebody about good taste and political correctness, you've definitely got the wrong guy. But look, what I have learned, Conor, is, I guess this line in the sand, right? It tends to move around. It's never in the same place. And every now and again you need to cross the line to realize actually where the line is, because it's fluid and societal attitudes change. And the UK 25 years ago when I started in Paddy Power, it's a totally different place to the UK of today, and same with Ireland and all other geographies. Attitudes change, behaviors change. But yeah, look, I'm not trying to deflect your question. When I look back at some of the old kind of Paddy Power campaigns of the noughties, Yeah, look, I think it's safe to say some of them haven't aged well. One of our first ads, along with the Granny's ad, was a recreation of the Last Supper, but like Jesus and all the apostles were in a casino playing card games, and I'm not entirely sure how that would go down now, or shooting chavs at Cheltenham, or money back on the Oscar Pistorius trial if he walks, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not entirely sure, you will get away with that stuff now. But I guess what we're missing now when we look back at all that old Paddy Power work is the context of the time and place when it originally ran. And the thing, the one the one important thing to remember about the Paddy Power brand was, it was always the brand that tended to say what young men believed but were too afraid to say themselves. So it was almost like this kind of proxy effect. So we always went out to, purposely provoke a reaction and flex in areas that most other brands wouldn't. But look, I guess, once again, to come back to your question, do I feel we crossed the line on a few campaigns? Yeah, look, we absolutely did. Would we be running some of the old campaigns we did 20 years ago now? Absolutely not. Like I say, they wouldn't be appropriate for the times we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, as you rightly point out, things are very different to how they were, especially when it comes to offense and sensitivity and things. And there's a lot, not only has the line moved, there are new lines being drawn all the time.
And new regulation that wasn't around 20 years ago. And there is, I'm sure we will talk about regulatory headwinds, but they're pretty significant and pretty limiting now in terms of creative processes and how the industry, I guess, can generally behave.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other change that you've gone through in your career as well, having launched the 10th Man, is previously you were overseeing advertising for a single brand. It seems, certainly from an outside perspective, you had quite a lot of creative freedom in that role. Now you have, a broad roster of clients, each with their own differing needs, probably with their own, independent, different audiences who have different sensibilities. How have you approached that, given your background, where it was a role where you were kind of constantly trying to push the envelope, and now moving into that more diversified responsibility that you have for your clients?
Yeah, well, look, when I step back, Conor, I originally created the 10th Man as a bit of a reaction to when I was marketing director at Paddy Power, and there was a lot of frustrations I had as a marketing director working with some of the big network advertising agencies around the world, because I spent obviously a lot of time in Dublin with Paddy's, but I did 5 or 6 years in London. Then when we acquired Sportsbet in Australia, spent a bit of time down in Melbourne. So I've worked with big ad agencies around the world, and the frustrations I tended to have were quite similar regardless of which agency it was or what country I was in. It tended to be, very few of them actually really understood the nuance of sports betting in the way I needed. The bigger they were, the slower they tended to move. None of them really got digital, despite what they might claim, in the way I needed. And, again, the bigger they were, the more expensive they tended to be. So they were kind of common frustrations. So, taking all those together, I spotted a market opportunity to create something new in the creative space that would really kind of be the ad agency that Ken Robertson, as marketing director of Paddy Power, would have been really excited and keen to work with. So that essentially was the proposition, was a agency created around being nimble, being agile, being stuffed to the gills with sports fanatics, having, a very thorough understanding of the sports betting and iGaming categories and everything that comes with that. So, but then as we kind of grew, and, we've been lucky to enjoy kind of very rapid growth over the last 7 years, there's been a kind of doubling in the size of the agency every year. So now, we've a lot of clients outside of sports betting. However, we do tend to over-index with clients in kind of what I consider quite tightly regulated space. So we do a lot in the alcohol space as well. We're one of the lead agencies for Diageo, working across Guinness as well. But kind of regardless of the category that our clients are finding themselves in, the kind of business challenges are quite similar. That people are finding increasingly difficult just to stand out from competitors. That there's this challenge around being caught in this kind of sea of sameness, and so the challenges that I guess the sports betting or the iGaming category face, I mean, they're not unique to those industries. Like we're hearing it from everybody that the number one challenge is how they differentiate their brand from a very kind of hyper competitive and in a way quite homogenous category that they find themselves in.
Yeah, so in terms of the kind of, I mean, personally, I find it's quite rare to see advertising campaigns that really stand out now, and that's probably always been the case, really. Obviously, kind of, there's this super over reliance on things like bonuses and offers to actually get customers in. The brand building, the creativity, and that kind of risk taking seems to be really, really limited. Is that just down to big sluggish agencies who don't know the sector well enough, or is there a kind of lack of appetite on the side of the actual brands themselves?
Yeah, I think a lot of the kind of senior marketing people on the brand side, on the client side, just need to take a bit of responsibility here. I mean, an ad agency will, most of the time just do what they're instructed to do by the CMO or the marketing director or the brand director. So, and definitely I've seen that, look, fundamentally, CMOs don't want to lose their jobs, right? So there's an inherent level of security by staying within the norms and I guess the tropes of your category.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that is everything ends up looking the same and sounding the same. And it is that kind of inherent fear of standing out and taking risks that is holding the category back in a way. And, I've said it before, the smartest thing in industry, a category CMO can do is just take a look at what every other brand is doing in the category and how they're showing up, and just make a conscious effort to turn up differently. I mean, it sounds kind of cliched and it sounds quite easy to do, but very few senior marketers just will take a punt on that, will roll the dice, are willing to take a risk. So, in contrast, in Paddy Power was drilled into us from Stuart Kenny, the founder of the business, that he didn't want to be like everybody else. So, the litmus test for any campaign that we created over the last 25 years in Paddy Power was, okay, would any other betting company do this? And if the answer was yes from anybody in the room, it was shelved. It was tossed out straight away.
Yeah. Now, without asking you to kind of state the obvious here, why do you think operating in that way is so effective in terms of actually, getting your brand to stick in people's minds and making that kind of recognition among the population? I know it seems obvious, but I mean, how much have you looked into the psychology behind this, and which of the tactics that you've used over the years do you think were the most effective at kind of garnering that recognition?
Yeah, well, psychology is an interesting word, and kind of, but I go back to that statement I made about Paddy Power brand earlier, and it is quite psychoanalytical in a way that, Paddy Power is a proxy for what young guys genuinely think, but because of the society we live in and potentially just pressure within that society, they're too afraid to say themselves. So Paddy Power is, well, traditionally was a mouthpiece for this generation of young guys who are sports mad. And, there's a little bit of mischief in the back of their head, but they think twice about kind of articulating that or bringing it to life. So, look, Paddy Power's success was the fact it was brave enough to say the things that other people wouldn't, right? And, you know, I know the category has really evolved over the last 25 years, but when you roll back the clock, it was a very conservative category, right? Very few people were willing to go outside the kind of norms of, you know, talking specifically about horse racing or talking specifically about football, or, you know, and then as that kind of manifested over time, you know, and marketing budgets increased and marketing techniques got more sophisticated. Instead of having an ad campaign with odds on a football match, you might recruit, you know, a former footballer as a brand ambassador. So it was all very logical and safe, and, you know, but you know, what does Paddy Power do? You know, we get Stephen Hawking as a brand ambassador, right, for a World Cup, and we say, right, instead of, you know, just dealing with another kind of washed up ex-footballer as our brand ambassador, we're going to jump into bed with the smartest guy in the world, and we're going to get him to tell you what the smartest bet in the World Cup is. And, you know, so it was that constant kind of reinvention of how we would approach marketing, but in a totally contrarian way. And, you know, when you do that, all of a sudden you've got this vast amount of clear water, clear space to operate in. And, you know, it just cuts through that sea of sameness that the category generally just kind of over relies on, back to the point, because an awful lot of senior marketing people in the category are just too afraid to take risks or too afraid to do different stuff, because, you know what, if it goes wrong, they're going to lose their job, and they really don't want to lose their job.
Yeah. Now, I wonder, I'm kind of trying to think back to those really early days and what the power of doing something kind of daring and controversial might have been. I wonder if there's a kind of almost a bit of irony in this. I see if you agree with this, because in those early days, you know, most of the population wouldn't dream of giving their bank details to any website, let alone a bookmaker online. You know, this idea of trust was a huge barrier to getting people onto betting online. Do you think there's a kind of irony in, you know, paddypower.com coming out and actually taking the piss a bit and having a laugh and playing around that would make people think, oh, well, they wouldn't be this bold if they weren't a trustworthy operation? And actually by being that kind of fun and playful, you create this impression of trustworthiness somehow. Is there any relevance in that, do you think?
I think there is something in it, Conor. I guess what Paddy Power had back then, when we did embark on this very deliberate kind of strategy of, you know, provocation or mischief making, or whatever you want to call it, like, Paddy Power had been a very successful, you know, high street retail business since 1986. So, you know, there was 100 shops to point to, probably more, probably around 150 by the time we launched .com. So it wasn't like this brand new early internet startup operator, which there were tons of around the same time. I'd say 99% of whom aren't around today. But, you know, Paddy Power was a legacy business. So, you know, when it came to, you know, trust and credit cards and all that type of super important stuff, particularly back in the early noughties, when, you know, this was a very important kind of issue, and, you know, there was a lot of horror stories going around. You know, Paddy Power was an established business, but I guess, you know, we deliberately chose with every marketing campaign to go quite big with them. You know, Stuart Kenny's the founder of Paddy Power. His kind of approach was a small ad in a newspaper kind of signposts a small business. So, you know, Stuart's philosophy was, if we're taking an ad in a newspaper, we take a full page ad. You know, if we're doing an outdoor campaign, we try and get whatever the most high profile 96 sheet is. If we're going on TV, let's do 60-second ads instead of 30-second ads, which absolutely destroyed and capsized our marketing budget super quick. But, you know, there was a little bit in that, in terms of how we turn up. We always turn up in a very credible way. So yeah, that was quite important.
Yeah. Now, you've already mentioned this, and I think there's a lot to be said for the restrictive regulatory environment, not only in the UK, which, the UK and Ireland, Paddy Power's biggest markets, but, you're working with brands right around the globe. You've got not only gambling, but as you mentioned, alcohol, several other industries as well. Tell me about your approach to regulatory restriction and the impact that you see it having on creativity, on brand building, on taking risks in the modern day, and how that's changed over the past couple of decades.
Well, look, it's obviously massively accelerated. We can already see this in the UK, Europe, and Australia, and the regulatory headwind is only going to get stronger. It's interesting. We do work with operators in North and South America, and obviously sports betting in particular is kind of in its infancy in both of those geographies. So regulation has not caught up as fast as it has in, say, UK, Europe, Australia. So you can, I guess, you can market yourselves in a slightly looser way in those geographies. But yeah, look, when it comes to working with European operators, you are somewhat limited in terms of, I guess, that slightly more provocative end of the marketing spectrum in terms of what you can do. And to be fair, there's not as much appetite as there would have been kind of 20 years ago. I suppose the flip side and the positive you can take out of it is forcing operators to think outside of the norms of what would be considered a traditional marketing mix, where up until quite recently, an awful lot of an operator's money would go on traditional above the line advertising. So your TV, your press, obviously supported by programmatic and digital and stuff. But increasingly, especially when it comes to broadcast media, it's becoming more and more challenging in terms of what you can get away on either of those channels. So it is forcing operators to think a little bit differently and a little bit outside of the box. And over the last 5 years, we've probably been asked to almost go back to the start of Paddy Power and start thinking about ways the brand can be amplified outside of the norm. So stunts have seen a massive resurgence, and increasingly we are being asked for kind of brand activations or stunts or quirky expressions of the brand that live outside of traditional media, because increasingly, they're tending to punch above their weight. And they're tending to kind of tick a box that maybe a 30-second TV spot can no longer do.
Yeah, I think as more of our lives move online, there's something increasingly powerful probably about putting things back into the real world.
Yeah.
Have you got any good stories from recent clients where you've done real world activations that have had a big impact?
Yeah, we did a really fun one quite recently for PointsBet, which actually is an Australian operator, but it had launched in the US a couple of years ago. More recently, it's been acquired by Fanatics. But when it was still PointsBet, they came to us and they had a couple of different things they were looking to, I guess, combine into a marketing campaign. One was they had a brand ambassador, Drew Brees, who's, I don't know if your listeners would know, but he was quite a prolific quarterback in his day, probably second to Tom Brady back in the day, won a couple of Super Bowls, but they had him as a quarterback. They did a new product launch called Lightning Bets, which essentially was a kind of, I guess, amped up version of in-play betting, where you can literally place a bet instantly on the next play in an American football match. So we had all this, and originally the idea was try and bring them together in some kind of advertising campaign. There was talk about a TV spot, but instead we got them to buy into this, essentially a stunt, where we pretended that we were shooting a TV spot for PointsBet for lightning bets in a place called Catatumbo in Venezuela, which is the home of lightning. It gets more lightning strikes in a calendar year than anywhere else in the face of the earth. And there was a bit of kind of behind the scenes footage, and all of a sudden a bolt of lightning comes down and strikes Drew Brees, right? And we leaked this on Reddit, Venezuelan Reddit, and it got picked up organically on South American TV networks. And all of a sudden, they start building a head of steam. And we had got Drew Brees, and we had basically, we had hid him away for the duration this stunt was happening. And it was incredible, Conor. You could see this organically just grow wings. So it started off on South American Reddit thread. Then it broke on a South American radio station. Then it was picked up by whatever the equivalent of BBC News in Venezuela is. Then all of a sudden it leaped into North America, and it ended up on CNN, ended up on Fox, and and the whole thing just cascaded. And our original plan was to keep it going for the weekend. So the story broke early on a Saturday morning, and we had to pull the plug on it by lunchtime on Saturday, because literally helicopters from CNN were flying over Drew Brees' house and all this type of stuff. So it goes to show. It generated over $50 million in earned media coverage in 6 hours. So, I don't think a TV spot will be kind of, doing that level of heavy lift. But it goes to show this stuff, we're almost going backwards to go forwards, but it goes to show it really, really works if you hit the right notes.
Yeah. That must be so satisfying when you're going to lengths to conceal the fact that this is actually coming from the brand. You're making it look like a leak. Yeah. And why would PointsBet have just published this on Venezuelan Reddit if they really wanted everyone to see?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a kind of covert ops approach to the whole thing, which is so much fun to be involved in. And the PointsBet marketing guys were great. It was the first time they had ever experienced this type of activation, I guess, and they loved it. And when it works, it really works.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I guess there's a kind of double-edged sword at the minute. Going back to the regulatory question, we have these increasing restrictions which limit the things that you can do. You have the kind of, I guess we have the waning power of, say, broadcast and, for example, print journalism, these things. On the other hand, you've got all this social media possibility. And of course, we're in a situation where we can create and share content much more quickly and much more easily by using, here we go, the buzzword of the decade, generative AI. Now, the 10th Man recently launched a campaign with SBK Sportsbook, if I'm not wrong, a Smarket Sportsbook. And this was, correct me, was it entirely AI generated, this ad campaign?
Yeah, start to finish. It was the first ever fully AI generated sports betting ad.
Very good. And why was the decision made to do that? I have seen the ad, and I can understand it would have been more difficult to create in real life.
Yeah.
But was this a case of jumping on the bandwagon, or was it a case of actually we found a way that we can do something for a fraction of the cost and much more efficiently, much more quickly, and all those other advantages? What was the kind of thinking behind it?
Well, look, I'm not going to lie, Conor. There was a sense of first mover advantage, and you only have one chance to be the first at anything. So we wanted that to be us, and SPK wanted that to be them. But as we kind of as we got going with the process, it became quick. It became apparent really quickly that allowed us to do, I guess what the betting industry desperately needs, to kind of move a lot faster, to cut through a lot harder, and to say something different. And it also, more importantly, allowed us to have really sky-high creative ambition without having sky-high production budgets. And I think that's where the real value of generative AI in the creative process, in the production process currently is. And, as technology gets better, I think that's only going to increase. The really important piece, and we can talk about this more, is, it's only as good as the kind of the human spark, that original idea, that's the catalyst to kind of produce the content. That's the really important part.
Yeah, Absolutely. And can you share anything about the specific tools that were used for generating that campaign?
Yeah, there was a lot of different ones because we were kind of, flying the plane as we were building it because this really hadn't been done before. So, there was a little bit of runway, a little bit of good old fashioned kind of chat GPT, a little bit of some of the new Google software that was actually just being released as we were kind of midway through the production of the ad itself. So it was kind of Frankensteined a little bit from around 4 or 5 different software applications. And yeah, so it was actually quite time consuming in a way. Start to finish, it took probably around 3 to 4 weeks all in. And that was proper graft because there's bit of a perception out there that you stick a prompt in one end and you get a finished ad out the other. It's really not as easy as that.
I bet, yeah. And speaking of AI generated content, I must admit, I was pleasantly surprised when I saw the SBK ad because it was actually good. But a little while before that, Kalshi had put out an AI generated ad before the NBA finals, I think.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely bloody awful, I thought. The production value was high, but it was kind of like an assault on the
Yeah.
sense every single person in the advert was shouting and screaming, and I just thought, oh God, we turn that off. For me, it was slightly concerning that this was a kind of sign of things to come. We're thinking about, people keep talking about AI slop populating the internet, and there certainly is plenty of that going around on social media, especially if you look at kind of legacy social media, you might say, like Facebook. There's some real crap doing the rounds. And this Kalshi ad, I'm sorry to say, I really didn't care for it. I found it to be very, very unpleasant watching. You've already mentioned that this is about the human spark behind the technology. I don't suppose I can blame generative AI for that quality in the advert. Like I say, the production value was very high. Is that just down to the creative team behind it and what their slightly shouty, unpleasant vision was?
Yeah, I would totally agree with you on that, Connor. I think, that felt like an ad that was produced using AI tools, but it also felt like it was written by generative AI tools as well. So it was desperately missing a proper creative hook or a proper creative idea. So yeah, wasn't a huge fan of that. But look, as an industry, we've been happily producing slop advertising for decades as well. I'd say 9 out of 10 sign up bonus ads. It's like, oh my God, I want to shoot myself in the face. They're terrible. But look, you're right. AI will be misused as a creative tool. Like I said, especially by, misguided marketers that think a rudimentary pump goes in at one end and a fully polished campaign comes out the other. Like it really doesn't work that way. Our learning with SBK is you literally be taking a single frame from this and matching it to another frame from this and stitching it all together in a way that it flows and it looks incredibly good. But when you remember there's 24 frames in a second and you have a 30-second ad, that's a lot of single frames that you need to stitch together. But it's definitely improving. There is going to be broader challenges with it. The tech can misfire. We've seen that. Increasingly, I think as a sector, we'll have to think long and hard about the ethics and authenticity of using AI, and when it needs to be called out that it is actually a fully AI production. But I think ignoring it because it feels scary is kind of like ignoring the internet because it was full of dodgy chat rooms back in the 90s. It for me, you don't sit it out, you just need to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of that, I want to know what your expectations are. You've seen decades of changes across the marketing sector, or the marketing industry across multiple sectors, let's say. What are your expectations now in terms of all the different changes we've discussed? We've got regulatory change, growth in internet use and social media and all the rest of it, and of course this huge spectre of AI. What are your expectations for, who knows, the next 5-10 years of? People don't like to do 10 years, it's too long. What about the next 5 years, let's say, of marketing? Where do you see things changing?
I mean, it's a really tricky one to answer, Conor, and the answer I would have given you even 12 months ago is probably different to the answer I'll give you now. We've been doing a lot of work in the US, and the US a really interesting market. It's still relatively in its infancy, but it is essentially a duopoly over there between the two big guys.
Yeah.
And that is an opportunity for some of the smaller guys, I think, to just do what Paddy Power did 25 years ago. And it feels like the industry, maybe not just in the US, but, closer to home in the UK and Europe, it feels like it's ripe for a disruptor. It feels like the category has just gotten a little bit stale. When I look at Flutter has now a combined market cap of over 50 billion euro, right? So that's bigger than the GDP of a lot of countries, okay? So, it's not in their interest to come out with provocative marketing campaigns now, because they're in the business of maximizing shareholder value. So why would they take risks, right? This is serious business for those guys. And similarly with an awful lot of the other big operators as well. So they are not going to fundamentally change the way they market themselves, because they're happy with what they're getting back from and what the return investment is. But what that does point to is the space for a real disruptor to come in and shake things up. In the way that Paddy Power did back in the day, when, there were kind of parallels to what's happening now. There was essentially a kind of monopoly situation with 3 or 4 big operators owning 90% of the market. And that's kind of what's happening now. And what Paddy Power did was it came in, it just blew the doors off the category, because it was willing to think differently, to do things differently, not to see itself as another betting brand, but to be an entertainment brand. So I'm not saying this will happen, but it is a hope I have that somebody comes up with the right idea to totally come in and challenge the status quo of where we find ourselves now. And I think if somebody or some new operator, some new entrepreneur can do that, I think that'll be a huge net positive for the industry and the category.
Yeah. Well, Ken, if anybody knows about challenging the status quo, it's you. And I think we can wrap it up on that note. It's really, really kind of you to come and share all this information with me. I really appreciate it. It's been a fascinating time getting some insight into your extremely interesting career, extremely distinguished. And yeah, once again, thank you for taking the time. It's much appreciated. I hope you'll come back in a year or two and we can see just what's changed. I think the rate of change is accelerating all the time, and it's an incredibly exciting time to be in this industry, and especially on the marketing side of things. So I can't wait to see what's next. But thank you very much for being with me today.
Thanks, Conor. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And thanks to everyone for watching. We'll be back another time with another guest and another episode. But until then, thanks again to Ken, and thanks for everyone at home for watching. Bye-bye.